Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. Warden Romp will be coming in, live streaming into us. So we'll go with that. We have a couple of members away, but we do have quorum, so we'll carry on. I would ask everyone to use their mic when they're speaking so that Brian can hear us. And this time I'd ask for a provision of disclosure of preliminary interest in the general nature of thereof, if anybody has any. Seeing none, the minutes of the February 3rd, 2025 meeting of the Planning Advisory Committee meeting. Moved by Jim Mosley, seconded by Sharon. Any questions? All in favor? So moved. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Abby and Dirk to let them carry on with the presentation in the order which they see fit. Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. I will start, and then Abby and others are going to do most of the work today. In terms of the agenda, an opportunity for a review of anything from last week, and then we were going to talk about engagement and public engagement. Then housing will be the bulk of the discussion. Transportation, the county engineer is going to join us partway through the meeting to talk about that. And then if we have time, we have some more information on the agenda, but I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware that we may not, there's a lot here. So if you don't have time to get through it, don't feel pressured to do that. We'll just move it to the next meeting, and then Abby's PowerPoint will be started for the next one. So in terms of review and discussion, the minutes already, I just wanted to, when Marcy and I talked about this before, I just wanted to make sure if there was any logistics or any questions of the committee members now that you've had one meeting. And then also just to clarify the committee feedback process. I think it's important, like the discussion that this committee has helps inform staff and the work that we continue to do, and ultimately the material that will go to county council. But it is a committee that gives recommendations. So there is the opportunity, if you feel strongly about matters or you want to be clear on something, that you could make motions and make recommendations to county council through a normal committee process. We just wanted to make sure that there were not any at the last meeting. So we want to make sure that you were aware that you did have that opportunity. So the first topic then is engagement, and we are using a consultant, Quarry Consulting. They are a firm that is already working with county council on a new strategic plan. And in fact, there was a lengthy meeting here yesterday with county council and Quarry. So they weren't able to sort of make it also work to be here today. So they gave me a presentation. I'm going to do my best on it. And then if there are any follow-up questions, then I will get back to you on that. So I guess just at a very high level, the slides include their sort of their perspective on it and some of their experience. The next slide, a couple down, shows the three staff people that have been assigned to this particular project and a little bit about their backgrounds. They've been, as I said already, working with county council and both in public engagement, stakeholder engagement. So they're already sort of up and running on work that the county is doing. And so we thought it was a sort of a natural to piggyback that and to take that forward for this particular project. Next slide, please. This is a general outline of their work plan. So phase one is just to go through all the existing information that what we've done to date, including the information that's gone to the Planning Advisory Committee. Then in sort of May to June, there's going to be engagement with the public, with stakeholders. There's going to be a number of workshops, which I'll get into in a second. And then ultimately, that information helps staff synthesize that and put that into planning documents or a recommendation to county council. And they also will do, we've included in the project that the consultant will come directly to council and report to them on sort of their findings with sort of without the filter of additional work through staff. In terms of communication methods, and we're a couple slides forward, website, social media, newspaper promotions, etc. Some of that is required under the Planning Act in terms of giving notice in local newspapers. Other parts are just sort of a best practice. The Quarry are going to assist with a stakeholder consultation, a questionnaire, again, piggybacking on a questionnaire that was sent out through our existing communication channels related to the strategic plan, just sort of expanding upon that with more of a land use planning lens. Workshops, open house, ultimately the public meeting, and then there will be county council meetings. The next slide goes a little more detailed sort of in their timing, but really that is just a very brief overview of their approach to this. And the final slide on this topic, we're really relying on their expertise and experience. We found them that they're doing terrific work already with County Council on the strat plan. But we did want to ask the committee if there were any other additional communication options that you think ought to be examined or that Quarry should take under consideration. Not hearing any, then the next topic is housing, and that I'll turn over to Abby.
Thank you, Dirk, through the chair. So first and foremost, I wanted to do a couple of introductions just to make the committee aware that we do have our housing consultant, Cassandra Vink, here with us today. She is going to be presenting the bulk of the slides on housing. And I also just wanted to make the committee aware that Cindy Howard is here with us today for any questions that may fall within her purview through the social services lens. So first and foremost, housing is a complex issue that has important implications for our communities and residents. Over the last 4 or so years, the provincial government has passed at least 8 housing-related bills, many of which are largely driven by the recommendations of the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force. So essentially, we can go through that document and almost like a checklist, check off some of the recommendations of that report and how they translated over into the legislative changes that we've seen. And then, of course, following the 8 housing bills, we've had the new provincial planning statement, which was implemented in October of 2024. So in terms of roles and responsibilities as it relates to housing, there are several, starting with the federal government through CMHC, which is largely funding based. They also do a lot of research and other work with the intent to make affordable housing more of a reality and more accessible. And then moving on to the province, the City of London as the Consolidated Municipal Service Manager, or CMSM, the county, local municipalities, the private sector, and the not-for-profit sector. And a lot of the times we see public and private partnerships for affordable housing as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is a picture of the housing continuum. It's directly from the Attainable Housing Review that was undertaken in 2022 and 2023. And just to note, and as shown on the slide, the PPS does address housing on the left side of the continuum at a higher level, but primarily focuses on housing policies that provide for the regional market area or closer to the right side of the housing continuum. The provision of housing towards the center and left typically involve additional government support, those private and public partnerships, NGOs, etc. And some of those examples on the housing continuum before us are like more within the purview of our social services department and other government agencies. So moving on to the policies of the provincial planning statement, I'm just going to touch on these at a high level. So the PPS provides that municipalities must provide for an appropriate range and mix of housing options and densities to meet projected needs of current and future residents of the regional market area. Next slide, please. In that municipalities must establish and implement minimum targets for the provision of housing that is affordable to low and moderate income households, and coordinate land use planning and planning for housing with service managers to address the full range of housing options, including affordable housing needs. So moving on to the next slide. The provincial planning statement included a new and updated definition of housing options. So it's pretty broad and starts with our more traditional forms of housing that we see on a day-to-day basis. So your singles, semis, multiplexes, garden suites. And then it gets more specific with regards to ownership type. So like co-ownership housing, cooperative housing, community land trusts. And then it gets more into occupant type. So farm workers or students are an example that's captured within that definition. And it also includes institutional type uses, such as long-term care homes, as well as like educational related housing or student housing on a campus. So moving on to the next slide. So through the legislative amendments made through one of the more recent housing bills, the province actually aligned the definition of affordable housing in the provincial planning statement with the Development Charges Act, which is great from a consistency perspective. So the provincial planning statement defines affordable in the case of ownership housing, the least expensive of housing for which the purchase price results in annual accommodation costs, which do not exceed 30% of gross annual household income for low and moderate income households, or housing for which the purchase price is at least 10% below the average purchase price of a resale unit in the municipality. So it would be the lesser of the two. In the case of rental housing, the PPS defines it as a unit for which the rent does not exceed 30% of gross annual household income for low and moderate income households, or a unit for which the rent is at or below the average market rent of a unit in the municipality. So moving on to the next slide. So this is a chart that was generated using the values that are provided through the housing bulletin that's provided under the DC Act, so the Development Charges Act. And it shows the affordable purchase price of a detached house, which is the lighter blue bar on the far left. And then the average purchase price of a detached house, which is in the middle, and then 90% of the average purchase price of a detached house, which is on the far right in the turquoise, by municipality, just for the committee's information. So when we consider the definition of affordable, majority of the time we're looking at that far left bar, which is the lesser of the two qualifiers, I guess. So moving on to the next slide. So essentially, we just wanted to provide the committee with some examples of housing that's currently on the market or was on the market in recent weeks that falls within those values that were provided in the previous slide. So the first one is a unit in Middlesex Center, 2-bed, 2-bath, that's actually located in a adults only resort style park and is listed at $379,900. So not something that's accessible to a family or a young adult. And it's also not very large, of course. The second example is a 1-bed, 2-bath in North Middlesex, which actually was the former ambulance base, and it is listed at $399,900. It's not currently habitable. There's no kitchen. It would require whoever purchases that to spend a bit more money to bring it up to a livable standard. And then the example from Southwest Middlesex is actually a townhouse, a 2-bed, 1.5-bath townhouse listed at $294,000. And I would just note that when I went in to kind of look and see what was available locally, a lot of the listings that were coming up were actually vacant lots. So they were intended to be sold off to be further built on by somebody with the means to do so. And I am going to pass things off to Cassandra for the rest of the housing discussion.
Thanks, Abby. Through you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. This first slide is the complementary slide to the one you saw for ownership in terms of what's considered affordable rental housing. And so on based on the definition, what's considered to be affordable rental is based on either the average market rent or what's affordable to the lowest 60% of households in the community. And so when this slide was prepared, or when this chart was prepared, the average market rent in Middlesex was $1,191. That rent is affordable units below, or you have to earn at least above 30% of all households. So the bottom 30% of households in your community wouldn't be able to afford that amount. But the units that are part of that CMHC survey do tend to be, so they're the primary rental housing. So typically apartments, they do tend to be older stock, sometimes smaller. And then we see a lot, especially in smaller centers and more rural areas, there's a lot of secondary rental, so single units being rented. And so some of those are listed on MLS. And when we looked at available units there, we saw an average rent of $2,800, which is closer to, so the bottom 70% of households in your community wouldn't be able to afford that rent. And then other sources of information on rental house prices are things like Kijiji, Facebook Marketplace, those sorts of things. And on average there, we saw that the average rent was about $2,300. So again, getting to the sixth or seventh decile, or 60 to 70% of your households wouldn't be able to afford that average rent. And then in London recently, a report that they put out, they said average 2-bedroom unit for $2,100, and that would require about an after-tax income of about $86,000. So you can kind of keep those in mind in terms of what we're talking about for what would be considered affordable rental and ownership. Next slide, please. I had the pleasure of working on the Attainable Housing Review, which was conducted in 2022 and 2023. And the aim of that review was to better understand the current supply and demand of housing across the housing continuum, with the intention of identifying gaps in the provision of housing and preparing a municipal strategy that can help ensure that a broad range of housing options are available to meet that full spectrum of both current needs and future needs. On the next slide shows that some of the feedback we heard through the engagement with various stakeholder groups that was conducted to inform that review. A number of the key issues that came up were related to affordability. Some use the words attainability. There were certainly concerns about the availability of housing that's affordable, the concerns around long wait lists for subsidized housing, and even affordability for those that might be able to afford a little bit more or higher ownership levels. So sometimes attainability of the housing. We heard about issues related to accessing support services, issues related to homelessness, a need for more housing diversity, and more workforce housing. In some cases, we heard concerns about lack of serviced land and about community perceptions against certain housing types or NIMBYism. Based on what we heard and a look at look at the data on what it showed the housing needs were, and a look at your existing policies in your official plan, we identified a number of policies, and we produced a number of reports. So on this next slide, it shows the reports that were completed as part of the review. The first one goes into more detail about what we heard as part of the consultation. The second one with the community. The second one was more engagement with your local municipal staff, as well as comparator municipalities to look at what they're doing, look at some of the best practices. Then we prepared that housing needs assessment, which included a lot of the quantitative analysis of housing needs. And we did a review of housing best practices as well. We prepared a resource guide on developing affordable rental housing. And then we had our final report, which includes a bit of a summary of some of those other pieces and outlines the recommendations that we have on housing moving forward. And also provided an implementation report to support the implementation of those recommendations. So many of those are up online if you wanted to take a closer look. As part of that work, the next slide shows the land use policy recommendations at a high level that we made as part of that review. So we made recommendations related to adopting some new housing targets. We also made recommendations about adapting your policy to maintain adequate land supply for housing. Some recommendations on implementing zoning solutions that can help reduce land costs and increase density. Some recommendations on policies to encourage a broader range of housing options. Recommendations to revise policies that restrict access to certain groups. So that could be those with various needs along with housing. We made recommendations on updating policies to support streamlined planning applications. We included a definition, a recommendation on the definition of affordable housing. We had recommendations around establishing modified standards for affordable housing, for prioritizing planning approvals for those affordable housing applications that came in, and rental retention policies. So many of those initial, or almost all of those initial recommendations are ones that we'll be speaking about today in further detail, where I'll be providing more information on what our specific recommendation is. So that was one source of the basis for the recommendations that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Another source was that updated provincial planning statement that was released in October. And then another one of the provincial bills that provided a lot of new updates. And that was the Cutting the Red Tape to Build More Homes Act, which also was enacted in 2024. So many of these recommendations are to move your policies forward to align with those provincial requirements. Okay. So your current official plan has a specific section on housing policies, and it requires that your plan and local official plans have policies to encourage a range of housing types and sizes and tenures to meet the demographic and market requirements of both current and future residents. The current plan has an affordability target of 20% of new residential units will be affordable, and requires that 15% of development occur through intensification, primarily within settlement areas. It also directs local municipalities to include their own criteria related to intensification and redevelopment, and includes sort of a placeholder policy that speaks to policies that were intended to come as part of the Attainable Housing Review. So with that, I'll move on to some of the recommended amendments. Some of them are simpler than others, so but feel free to jump in at any time with any questions. So the first one is just to add a policy that allows municipalities to waive heritage impact assessments for housing projects that have a significant public interest or are aligned with provincial priorities, where those developments aren't situated on significant built heritage resources or cultural heritage landscapes. So from what I understand, local municipalities aren't necessarily currently requiring heritage impact assessments. So this isn't necessarily something that will be used right away, but should a municipality decide to do that, this gives the direction that that they can waive those requirements where it makes sense to do so. And that permission was made as a result of that, the province's Cutting the Red Tape to Build More Homes Act. The next recommendation is to revise the introduction within your growth management section. And the recommended revision is to provide direction that local municipalities shall consider the opportunity to allocate and reallocate, if necessary, unused system capacity of municipal water services and sewage services to support the efficient use of those services and meet current and projected needs for increasing housing supply. That aligns with the provincial regulations as well, the updated regulations. And then the second one is related to the section on economic development. The current section states that surplus land could be considered for affordable housing projects, among other considerations. But with the new legislation, municipalities are actually to consider that surplus land for affordable housing as a first consideration, as opposed to.
We have a question down here for you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, when go back to the other one, the recommended amendments, the 3.2.1. Is that saying then the municipality could move the development areas to take in areas that are now serviceable and remove other ones that are not serviceable at this time?
No, but I'll let Abby's.
Okay,
Thanks.
it's always a point of contention.
So this is actually a newer permission that was provided for through Bill 185, and it is specifically with regards to servicing allocations. So essentially, it would require a municipality to work through some type of servicing allocation policy, likely with their engineering consultant. And then usually it would be tied to the lapse provisions on a draft plan approval, so that if a developer hadn't started to undertake works on a draft plan approved development, they would be able to reallocate the servicing capacity to a different development if they were to act quicker or develop at a faster pace.
And this is new.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just add to that. So this wouldn't include the settlement area changes that were recently implemented. This is specifically in regards to servicing allocation, so not adding or removing from the settlement area, just to clarify.
But just if I could, because say if a municipality has a spot and they've since they've charged for oversizing in certain areas, and developers have paid that, but they're not anywhere near being able to get on the municipal system, then that's the question I've got. So can they reallocate that to someplace in the planning area that would allow them to allow another developer to move ahead of that because there's no contribution towards the system?
So I'm just trying to clarify what you're asking. So are you asking if they could remove those lands from the settlement area boundary and?
No, they could leave them in the settled area boundary, but it could cost millions to develop that area, and the municipality is not prepared to move forward with that. But it would allow, if you don't have to leave that currently tied into your system for the 85% of your capacity for your wastewater, then would you allow another area that's within the development area to be able to expand on that person's allocations?
Sorry, that would be within the municipality's purview through these permissions.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Abby, through the chair. Are we talking sort of the use it or lose it?
Yes, that's correct. That's what we refer to these as.
So my understanding of it is that certain amount of water, wastewater is allocated to a developer when they get their approvals. If for some reason or another they don't move forward and it doesn't look like they're going to move forward, my understanding is that in those particular cases, and I would imagine it would be at the extreme, then if somebody else came in and needed that wastewater, if those people weren't, that group wasn't going to go forward, then the municipality could reallocate that waterways. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll save that discussion for the ride home. Thank you.
I would just note that that's all subject to like a servicing allocation policy that would be adopted by the municipality.
Okay, and then the next slide starts getting into some of the core aspects of your housing policies. So in the current version of your official plan, it indicates the county supports various things, a number of these things that are listed below. Whereas in the recommended version, we're suggesting changing the wording to the county and local municipalities will. And in many cases, that's because because the province is now requiring you to do these things. So we're suggesting that you include in here targets related to affordable rental housing, affordable and attainable ownership housing, purpose-built rental, and multiple units or apartment buildings. So based on our analysis as part of the attainable housing review, and to try to sort of move the needle a bit in the community, we are recommending that the county adopt targets of that 10% of all new units will be affordable rental, that 15% of all new units will be affordable and attainable ownership housing, and that 10% will be purpose-built rental units, and 25% of new units will be in the form of multiple units or apartment buildings. Another component of these policies, policy recommendations is to permit and facilitate all additional needs housing. So that's any form of housing where residents may require some form of support beyond just having housing. And we're recommending removing references to what's called special needs housing, as well as references to boarding homes and rooming houses and group homes, and just clustering those all as shared housing so that your policies, both your official plan policies and your zoning policies, are based on the form of use and the type of use rather than the specific users that are within that housing. Another component of this policy is to prioritize and permit and facilitate residential intensification. And right now, the county currently requires that 10% of all 15% of all development be intensification. And also to promote densities in new housing, which will efficiently use land and resources. And that the county and local municipalities will promote the retention of rental housing. Also on the next slide, you'll see some more housing policies in this section. We're recommending that you include a policy that the county will prioritize surplus land for affordable and or supportive housing. That the county will prioritize planning approvals for affordable housing, and through the county's OP, encourage local municipalities to do that as well. Also to encourage local municipalities to remove their references to minimum separation distances for various forms of shared housing. So that's things like group homes, boarding homes, lodging homes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So somewhere in this policy, it talks about maximum density?
So that is one of the things that we do want to talk about today. So part of the new provincial requirements are for municipalities to establish minimum densities. And right now we're recommending a policy that the county require local municipalities to establish minimum densities as part of their official plans. But at this stage, we haven't recommended specific minimum densities for settlement areas through the county's official plan. But that is something we can talk about whether you want to go further than what is recommended in there right now and be a little bit more prescriptive.
Mr. Chair, if I could, because, and I just reading one about like in Oxford County where they got a big upheaval because of the size of density in one little block. And they you know, the way I read it, the council turned it down, but they got appeal periods, but like, and that's why I'm asking if there's any maximum, because it takes it away from a political knee-jerk discussion.
Thanks for that question. So typically the densities are, so you might have some overarching general statements in your official plan and then have some more specifics for specific zones within your zoning bylaw that would have more details on the height restrictions, setback restrictions, some of those things that result in that implementation of those density targets. So pieces. So they're not necessarily something that is prescribed as in detail typically in the official plans. Okay. So here we're recommending that local municipalities remove references to minimum separation distances, as we know that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal has said that municipalities are not allowed to discriminate between or against specific groups like those needing supports. And just permitting those types of housing in all areas where residential dwellings are permitted. So really using those same tools as you have to regulate other forms of housing. Just another.
Excuse me, I just have a question for you, or for you or Dirk. All these changes, a lot of municipalities have their official plans in place. Are we going to have to? Are those municipalities got to go back and review their official plans and come in compliance with all this stuff?
To the chair, I guess the short answer is yes. There is an implementation time period, of course. So the provincial policy statement changes. All municipal decisions are already required to be consistent with the provincial planning statement. So some of this we're already required to do, and now we just need to make sure that our documents are up to date to reflect that. But yes, there will be another round of changes to local planning documents, even though some of them, or many of them, are not in place yet from the last round in litigation.
Here we're just the next one is more of an objective, a general policy that the county and local municipalities will take a coordinated approach to planning for housing with the City of London, given that it's the municipal service manager for the community. And that local municipalities will have to have consistent definitions of affordable housing as the county's official plan. Then on the next slide, these policies speak to encouraging a range and mix of housing types. So what's currently in here is that local municipalities will establish the mix of types and tenures in their official plans, but we're suggesting that that reference be removed, as we're suggesting including the targets directly within the county's official plan. And then in our draft recommended policies, we've added some additional examples of other policies that municipalities could consider to reduce housing costs. Whether that's things like having reduced lot lines, reduced parking, things like that, and other examples of policies that could support a range of housing options. So just different types like laneway housing, various forms of housing, and to include a policy to require local municipalities to adopt targets that are consistent with or greater than the county's targets, so that you're all working in tandem. Then there's a few recommendations related to intensification and redevelopment. So here we're recommending adding a policy that the county and local municipalities will support compact built forms. We've added some recommendation, add some examples of different types of housing intensification and redevelopment and compact built forms that could be considered. And add a policy that local municipal OPs address minimum densities, which is a requirement of the PPS. Then there's a couple recommendations related to additional residential units, and in particular in your section on agricultural permitted uses. So I think this will probably be the topic that will need the most discussion on today, is that additional residential units. So I'll briefly explain the recommendation first, and then I'll provide a bit of additional context. So we've recommended revising your agricultural permitted uses section to expand permissions for additional residential units beyond what's currently permitted, is that they additional residential units be permitted in settlement areas with full municipal water and sewage services. And we're recommending that those be expanded to all areas where a residential unit is permitted, and clarify that in agricultural areas that 2 additional residential units are permitted, in addition to the farm worker housing that's permitted as an agricultural use, but to include some criteria around those units. So those could include things like at least one of those additional units needs to be attached to or within the primary dwelling, that the units need to be compatible with and not hinder surrounding agricultural operations, that there's appropriate sewage and water services, that they address any public health or safety concerns, and that they minimize land that's taken out of agricultural production. So just for some additional context, this next slide provides some examples of what additional residential units could look like. So that first one, primary dwelling on the top, additional residential units as a basement apartment. Another form is if they're attached as an accessory apartment. Another one is where they're a detached structure to the primary dwelling unit. The one on the bottom left has the primary dwelling unit on the top, the basement apartment underneath, as well as an additional detached structure. Or another form could be the accessory apartment is on top and the primary dwelling unit is below. So those are just to get you thinking about some of those different types of additional residential units. So the policies that have been in existence across the province since 2022 permitted as of right up to 3 additional residential units in fully serviced settlement areas across the province. And then with the new PPS that was released in October or in place in October, it states that where a residential dwelling is permitted on a lot in the primary agricultural area, up to 2 additional residential units shall be permitted based on provincial guidance, or provided that at least one is located within or attached to the principal dwelling. And then there's a number of other criteria that they have to meet, like minimum separation distance from agriculture, compatible with the surrounding agricultural operations, that they have the appropriate water and sewage, and they're limited in scale and located within or attached or in close proximity to the principal dwelling or farm building cluster, and that they minimize land taken out of agricultural production. So I'll let Abby speak a little bit about some of the considerations that municipalities are already dealing with in their additional residential proposals, so that we can have a bit more of a discussion about what some of the policy options might be.
Thank you, Cassandra. Through the chair. Yeah, so the purpose of this slide is to kind of give the committee some examples of some of the questions that staff have received locally in the proposals that we've received over the past, I would say, like 2 years. They've been coming in for. So the first point here, we have reverse. So essentially, staff have been getting questions from landowners in several of the municipalities locally in regards to retaining the existing dwelling and having it become the ARU on the lot while they construct a much larger dwelling on the same lot. So we've dealt with that in numerous circumstances. I think we have a few that have come to fruition. I don't know if you have any more to add on that, Dirk.
No, it's an interesting topic, and we really appreciate the committee's thoughts on it. Really, we have had discussions with the province. It's not their intention, but the policies, don't say you can't specifically. So we certainly had a number of these requests, and they can be quite large. And particularly close to the city of London, where you have people that want to sort of live within commuting distance. So we'd really appreciate the committee's input on it.
Thank you. And then clustering. So we've also had some proposals whereby a landowner is looking to construct an ARU on their large agricultural parcel, not within the existing building cluster. This is more prevalent, obviously, on a corner lot where they have frontage on 2 separate roads. So it would be a sizable distance between the primary dwelling and the ARU on the lot that the landowner is looking for. So again, as Dirk said, we really appreciate the committee's feedback and opinions on this one as well. And then servicing. So I guess just the idea of requiring the ARU and the primary dwelling to be co-serviced or separately serviced. This is really, I guess, more within the building department's purview. But certainly, I think there's room for discussion on this from a planning perspective as well. And then, of course, the size of the ARU relative to the size of the primary dwelling and or property. So again, looking for the committee's feedback on how big we should be allowing ARUs to be in relation to the existing dwelling on the lot. Whether that be a percentage of the existing dwelling or relative to the lot size itself. And then, of course, official plan versus zoning. So what we should be providing for through our official plan policies versus what we should be regulating in our zoning bylaws. So a lot of the points that I mentioned prior, so size, a maximum distance separation. It could even go as far as defining the primary dwelling and then defining the ARU. And I guess just any discussion or input on whether that should be through the official plan or through regulation in the zoning bylaw, as well as any other points or comments or concerns that members of the committee have heard from members of the public in their municipality. We're always open to hear more, of course, and get any more feedback on the additional residential unit front.
So through the chair, this whole issue of the ARUs does present a bit of a wrinkle. In its basic terms, it seems to me that it's a solution to, say, for example, to add more housing units in. Now, on a standard lot in a built-up area, I don't think there are the same sort of concerns as you might have in a more rural property. Keeping those ARUs nested and under possibly some common service in terms of water and sewage prevents the possibility that down the road that same unit could be, there could be an application for a severance, which opens up another little wrinkle. So in my opinion, it shouldn't necessarily be left municipality to municipality, that there could maybe be a broader definition from the county. If we stuck to the real intention of the ARU, then I think that clustering and any of the examples that you've used above make far more sense. I know that even I can speak from Thames Centre that although there are no applications right at the moment, there have been a lot of questions as to the size of the ARU. I'm not sure that I have a hard and fast thought about it, but running in the back of my mind is, does it really defeat the process for the original intention of the ARU? And maybe that's on the province. Maybe they could have made it a little clearer. But I'm not sure that dumping it into zoning is necessarily the answer. But I would welcome anybody else's thoughts from other municipalities.
Yeah, I think when we talk about size of ARUs, if we don't have some sort of limit, then they get bigger than the existing unit. And the existing unit then is classified as ARU because it's smaller. So I think if we don't have a specific size, whether it's 50%, 75% of the main unit, then we can get reversals happening. And as you say, down the road, there's that opportunity then that both units are of a size that they could be severed sometime in the future, because that's always a challenge. And also with the distance between the ARU and the main thing, if we start getting them, at one corner of the farm and then at the other corner of the farm, that starts impacting minimum distance separations to existing farms that may have livestock. So that would impact them from expanding or even creating a new livestock operation because of the distance between. So I think that's a major concern, that they have to be clustered and not spread out. Brian, you have a comment? Go ahead.
I'm working on it. Sorry, John. Yeah, I think a lot of the comments are very valid, especially to the possibility of severances and how people could make that work for severing off pieces. And your points and Sharon's are very good. I think honestly, it wasn't very long ago that a lot of us cleaned up a lot of the extra uh, buildings, the extra houses that were on farms, where 2 or 3 farms houses were built on it. And we were instructed to clean that up, and now it's going in the reverse. My my comment, I guess, is we're already dealing with some of that issue. And I do have a question to it. Can you build these buildings? Do they have to be year-round living, or are these rental units? Or what is actually the definition of what they can always all do with these ARUs? That's a question I would have.
Thank you for that question. Through you, Chair. Municipalities can regulate whether you permit the units to be short-term rental housing or whether you just leave it open and not prescriptive in that area. So they could be long-term rental, or you could have both, both long-term and short-term.
So in fact, if I can follow up to that, we're basically going to, they could be used almost as a campground type of settings. You could have put into that, I suppose.
Yes, if the county and municipalities chose to permit that, that could be what some of them do end up being used for.
Okay, thank you. Also, on the numbers of earlier when we talked about the percentages for affordable housing and the different housing, is that all provincially legislated now? Is that what we have to follow, or can we adjust to that as well?
Sorry, so that was just so I'm clear on the question. So that was the targets for affordable rental housing?
Yes, for all the targets, the percentages of when they build, what we have to build. Okay. Is that all provincially legislated now?
So the province requires municipalities to provide housing to meet the needs of current and future residents, including low and moderate income households. It isn't specific, it isn't prescriptive in terms of what your specific target needs to be. It just needs to align with current and future needs. So those specific numbers that you've been presented with today are recommendations for this community, and not specific or not prescribed across the province or in certain areas.
Okay. I thank you. The last question I have, if I may, Mr. Chair, is when we talk about these extra buildings in our urban areas, in our small urban areas, and building those, if I understand this right, it is all contingent on capacity for wastewater treatment and water, correct? The services?
Through you, Chair. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm good now. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Just on a comment on these ARUs, when looking at it, and it's only from my limited participation in it, but I think it sets up for a lot of severances in the future. The other thing is to the chair's point is that you build it at a certain percentage of the main home that's in the agricultural area that's described as that say the parents of the farm. You build it a certain thing. What's to stop anybody from coming in a year and asking for an addition? I guess that's, when I look at it, because I think over the years, been so many different ways to try to get severance in the agricultural area. And, I just, I can see it as a problem. But the other thing for sure, they should be on their own municipal water, or not municipal, but on their own wastewater and water, even in the agricultural zone. They wouldn't be on municipal, but because you had an item in here about shared services. That's all, just a comment. Thank you.
Through you. If somebody applied for this, could you just mandate that it can't be severed? And then like it has to be ripped down. And then I have one other question. On there, it showed the London was using 30% of net income, but the province uses 30% of gross. Did I understand that correctly?
Thanks for those questions. So, so you could be very prescriptive and consistent in not allowing severances. So that's one way to mitigate some of those risks is being prescriptive and never providing a precedent for something else. And then, yes, in terms of the numbers that are typically used to calculate what's considered affordable, generally we do use the before tax income rather than the after tax income as the 30% of income. So, but yes, you're right that is different between what was like what the city's number showed they were using after tax.
Exactly 30% of after tax income.
Yeah, but typically, and based on what the province requires, it's the gross.
Through the chair. I just want to go back to the ARUs for a minute. Dirk, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but in built up areas where there are municipal water and sewer, you could have multiple ARUs. You could have an ARU in your basement. You could have one in as your garage converted. Does that present any problems to municipalities in terms of too many people in one place and causing problems to neighbors? Do we have to address that through zoning? Can we make any sort of limitations on the number of ARUs in built up areas? Or is it just sort of catch as catch can and deal with it as it comes?
Maybe I'll start, and then Cassandra probably has experience from some other communities too to help us. Yeah, it hasn't been around long enough, I think, for us to really understand the implications. I think one of the fears that I hear from some, say, local municipal staff is, what if we had a lot of these in a particular street and it sort of builds and builds? Because you're absolutely right. If you have 3 units and it's allowed as of right by the province, in many of our communities, people rely on automobiles, of course. And so you have 3 or 6 or some number of vehicles. And where is that? Where do those vehicles end up? Do they end up on the street, or do they end up using nearby someone else's parking lot, a commercial parking lot or something like that? So, but I don't know that we've had enough experience to sort of know what those implications are. But Sandra, I don't know if you'd have anything else.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think when we've seen in communities that started permitting 1 unit quite a number of years ago, we have found that generally we're not seeing a lot of additional demands or impacts on the communities. We haven't had as much experience yet of places doing 3. But sometimes large families with teenagers can also, and multiple vehicles can have similar impacts as having some additional residential units. So yeah, it's hard to say what some of those impacts are, but I think in general, we to date haven't seen significant impacts, but that could change with if that, like you said, if a lot happened on one street and that sort of thing.
Thank you, but I guess what I'm more driving at is how do we deal with it in the future? Can we anticipate it? Should we be looking at some sort of policy now before something happens? I mean, we're constantly bombarded with information that we need more housing and we need more affordable housing. So it may not be immediately on our doorstep, but I could see a time when that, as municipalities grow, that maybe that would be a problem we would need to address, and maybe we should be prepared for it rather than knee-jerk, sort of reactive, maybe something more proactive. I'd like to ask one other question, if I may, while I have the mic. Targets, housing targets. It was my initial perception that if your municipality was below 50,000 people, you did not have specifically regulated provincial housing targets. Now everybody's working to do as much as they can in their municipalities in terms of both density and housing types, and so that we have better offerings for people who are either living in our communities now or going forward. But how are those targets established?
Through you, Chair. So on the first piece, on the proactive piece, I think some of it is a balance of, yes, we need additional housing, and we also want to intensify existing areas and use that land and those existing servicing more efficiently. So that is some of the intention around those policies. And I think you can. I thought of one other area where you might look to see some of the impacts. So right around Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, a number of those streets right around campus used to be single detached homes, and now they're heavily intensified. Sure, there's a bit of parking congestion at times, but it's dealt with through bylaw. But I think it does provide a lot more housing for those students in close proximity to the school. So I don't think there's too many negative impacts, even with that increased density within in the area. Then regarding the option or the that there isn't a prescribed target when the number of residents are below 50,000 people, I'm not familiar with that. Exception, I guess, and the province, just to be clear as well, that the province doesn't prescribe what the specific targets are. That's up to the municipality, but the province does require you to have targets or to have policies and practices to meet the needs of lower and moderate income households. So I don't know, Dirk, if you wanted to add anything there.
Through the chair, if I can, there are different targets, of course, the same word, but there are the percentage of development that's a certain type of housing. The province requires, to my understanding, that we have targets, but doesn't prescribe it. And frankly, I think that makes a lot of sense. Toronto and Lucan are very different and ought not to have the same sort of numbers. But there is, separate from that, there are the provincial housing targets that are mandated to people like the City of London, where they provide so many units over a certain period of time. But Middlesex County and our local municipalities are not prescribed those number of units to be provided. So that the different numbers, but similar implications, I guess.
Okay, I think we'll put a hold on that for a couple of seconds. We'll give you a 5-minute break. We'll come back in 5 minutes and continue on. Can I get a motion for that, Jim? Brad? All in favor? Good, we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. Yeah, we'll just wait until we get everybody back and then we'll start again. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order, and I just want to ask um, if the committee wants to make any formal recommendations to county council on some of the ARU stuff that we've been talking about. We've discussed it, and it's good for staff to hear that and deal with it. But I just wondering if there's anything that you want to send back to county council on that issue.
I'd like to see one parking space for every unit guaranteed. Yeah, like already in my town, everybody parks on the boulevard. So I can only imagine if anything was added, we would be congested with it'll be an issue.
Through you, Chair. With the most recent amendments that the province put in place, they have prohibited municipalities from prescribing parking requirements for ADUs. So no parking requirements.
Is there anything else anybody wants to bring forward to county that we can do? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, John, because we did discuss it in the agricultural area, how could you limit it so that there's no way of getting a severance, say, in the future, or the size? I mean, if you write it so that the trouble is, and I don't like, it's not that I got anything against planners, Dirk, but a lot of times the planner come in and talk to council and say this was the intent, and it wasn't the intent. But it's always, what's good for the client, and how can you write it so that you don't have that? Yeah, I'm asking that question, Mr. Chair.
Are you wanting something put forward through the planners to the county council that would go into the official plan to prohibit the severance of those units?
Yeah, if they feel they're going to write something strong enough to protect that.
I'll turn to our planners and see what their comment is.
Thanks for that question. So yes, I think absolutely you should put in a policy around not permitting severances, which is generally in there already. But I hear what you're saying on there can be exceptions, and that's where I think the considerations related to size, the reverse ARUs, and clustering and servicing sort of all come into play as considerations. I don't think any of those things are as relevant in the settlement areas that you need to be as prescriptive on any of those items, given the lot sizes and the chance of requiring severances and that sort of thing. But I think those are things that potentially you may want to consider in the rural areas to help reduce that risk of people coming for severancing later. And sort of it does speak to the intent of that policy in agricultural areas, that the intent is to preserve agricultural prime agricultural land. So one possibility is that you could prescribe not permitting the existing dwelling to become the ARU unless for valid criteria or valid reasons, and they could include that they will go through the requirements of ensuring those other units meet the requirements of an ARU, whether that's, you know, building code or that sort of thing, and that maybe that existing unit meets a certain, is sufficiently small, that sort of thing as well. The regulated, and then clustering for sure. I think you could speak to some specific maximum separation distances and have some, you know, in some provisions around that, unless there's, you know, topographical challenges and that sort of thing. The size relative to the primary dwelling is a little bit of a harder one to regulate or to decide on an appropriate size. Because I think there are valid reasons for it to be, could be 50%, could be more than 50%. If, you know, if you're trying to create something that's accessible, moving forward, or, you know, for a number of reasons. But I think there are, if your intention is, if you're concerned about, the risk of severance, I think you could recommend to council that there be some integration of policies that will reduce the risk of severance by putting in some additional criteria around having the existing dwellings become ARUs and the clustering. And
no, I'm good. I was thinking of severance as well in the hamlet areas, or the, you know, but I think now the municipality can still allow that if they're adequate size. So I don't want to go down that road, but I was thinking that at first, and then I rethought it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I think it's important that the clustering factor be included in some sort of a policy going back to county council, and also the size. I'm not sure how you come up with that size, but I think we need to have a size so that we don't get into the situation where the ARU becomes larger than the original unit, then it becomes the ARU. I think we want to keep the main unit as the main unit, and any ARU can only be 50, 60% of that unit. And it has to be within a certain distance so that we don't sterilize any more land. Brian, do you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And it was more on, we've had a lot of surplus farm dwelling severances on our farms. And we've had a lot of them. And does it include, like, in those severances, they're not allowed to build? But will this change that? Will they be allowed to build an ARU on those surplus farm dwelling severances?
Chair, if I could start with this one. I think that when you sever a surplus dwelling out, you could build an ARU with that dwelling either in or behind it. You would not be able to build the ARU on the remnant farm parcel, which is prohibited from having a new dwelling unit.
Right. But you would be permitted to do it on that severed piece?
Yes, you would be.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else?
Just one final comment on that. So it would be within our purview to say an ARU, for example, I'm not suggesting, but could not be more than, say, 80% of the original building structure. And it would have to be within a certain distance to take advantage of both the existing structure and the services on the property, because then that way it keeps the real purpose of the ARU. I'm only just throwing that out there. I'm not necessarily making motions or anything, but something as, because I really believe that in rural properties, we're going to need some sort of criteria so we don't run into this problem.
Okay, Marcy's got a comment here or a proposal, so I'll let her read that and then we can decide if we get a mover in a second or fourth.
So that county council consider including language in the official plan to prohibit the severance of ARUs in rural areas and to address size, reverse ARUs, and clustering.
So where I live, a lot of people build a really nice house and then they tear down a house. But if you allowed them to build a nice house on their farm and you allowed them to keep that small house, wouldn't they be able to make that more affordable? Right,
Most of the time, when someone applies to build a new house, the existing house has to be tore down. And that's usually part of the criteria to build a new house, that the old one has to be tore down within up to 3 years after the new house is built or occupancy year occurs. So it's not meant to allow the old house to become an ARU.
So like they would build a new house, rip that house down, and then build an ARU?
They could possibly do that, yes. But it would have to meet the criteria that we're trying to get in place here.
Through you, Chair. I can speak to that a little bit more as well. So yeah, I think there is a need to balance different policy objectives, because you're absolutely right that that helps contribute to the policy objective of increasing the supply of affordable rental housing. Whereas some of the provinces' ARU policies also are trying to balance the need to preserve primary or prime agricultural land as well. And so, right, I think one other thing that we should probably keep in mind based on the province's current policies, in order to have an ARU in agricultural areas, at least one has to be attached or within the existing dwelling. So based on that, you couldn't just have another mansion and the smaller one if you didn't have one attached to one of those. But yeah, it depends what you consider to be the primary versus the ARU. But yeah, so I think it's a need to balance different policy objectives there.
Okay, we've got a motion on the floor. Go ahead, Brad. Okay, so we've got the motion on the floor. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? So moved. So we'll send that back to county or to planners, and they can bring it to county council at some point. Go ahead, carry on.
Thank you for that discussion and direction. That's certainly very helpful. Okay, a couple of the next few I don't think are quite as contentious. We're suggesting adding to the section on settlement areas to specify that local municipalities will plan their settlement areas to achieve complete communities. So access to a range of amenities and services, a compact built form, mixed use development, and support an appropriate range and mix of housing, including affordable, accessible, and equitable housing. And that equitable and accessible piece are new language in the PPS. We're also recommending that in the section on urban areas that local municipalities will adopt zoning standards that promote higher density in those areas. And then on the next slide, we're suggesting revising the section on detailed land use policies related to local official plans to remove the reference that's in there to special needs housing and replace that with additional needs housing, shared housing, and accessible housing.
I have a question for you on intensification of the lands that we have in urban areas now. It's now possible, like if the municipality has an official plan, does an official plan, they don't put lands into a urban center, that a developer then can then apply now to have area outside the urban center brought into the urban center. So that really affects the intensification, because if they're allowed to do that, now there's all this extra land available in that urban center. So you don't get to intensify before you add to it. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and so I think that's where your strong policies, as well as your strong policy direction from council, needs to come in. So while they can apply for it, you don't have to approve it, or you can put in place certain requirements around like minimum intensification targets, and not allow them to bring those in if it's going to throw off that balance.
If I could add to that quickly, you could also use tools like a CIP to encourage intensification. So incentivizing developers to intensify through the use of a community improvement plan is another option.
Mr. Chair, just so I clarify, the settlement areas, is that like the development areas, or is that the hamlets that you know, are they're sometimes classed as settlement areas or clusters and so on? Because when I look at this for to intensify in there, they don't have the wastewater capacity or the municipal water services. So I just want to know if that's clearly just the areas that do have full services, or is it any place within that within the county? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And so county's official plan currently has designation for urban areas and then settlement areas more broadly, which would include those hamlets. And so you could put in place intensification targets or requirements specific to urban areas versus some of those hamlets.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So then my interpretation is correct, is that the settlement area is like a hamlet area, and then the urban area is your development area within the larger centers.
I believe settlement area would include both the urban areas and the hamlets. Yeah.
One whole thing.
Sorry, I will start over so that the warden can hear. The county's official plan establishes settlement areas as the broad category, and then there are urban areas, community areas, and hamlets. Strathroy would be an urban area, obviously. Community areas, perhaps somewhere like Delaware, where not full services aren't available today, and then a hamlet would be your Crampton. And certainly policies can be different. Infilling or redevelopment or intensification in Crampton might be a single lot, kind of wedged in, as opposed to what you might see in Strathroy. So the policies can be differentiated based both on community size and fundamentally on full urban services or not.
Ryan, do you have any questions there?
No, sorry, John, I'm good. I appreciate, Dirk, that you clarified that a little bit better, that we can actually put some regulation on that.
Okay, and on the next slide, we have some recommended revisions to some of your implementation policies around revising the section for local zoning bylaws. So we're recommending to add that municipalities shall keep their zoning bylaws up to date with the official plans, with their official plan and the county's official plan, by establishing permitted uses, minimum density targets for both new and expanded settlement areas, heights, and other development standards to accommodate growth and development, and that local municipalities are encouraged to permit triplexes and multiplexes without requiring zoning applications. Then we're also recommending that the county add a few definitions to its glossary of terms, so that you define additional needs housing similar to how it's defined in the PPS, that you define affordable and attainable ownership housing, affordable rental housing, compact built form, complete communities. Again, those are all in the PPS, and that you define what shared housing is, and that you remove the definition, or that you revise the definition of housing to remove the reference to housing for people with special needs, and add things like shared housing, additional needs housing, and other housing forms. And then, did you want to skip to this one? So this last slide is really to get your thoughts on whether the county official plan should go further than the policies that we've recommended. And I'll let Abby speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, so Cassandra really just discussed the really the land use recommendations of the Attainable Housing Review. And we wanted to include these 3 points on this slide to kind of get the committee's opinion on taking the policies kind of above and beyond the land use recommendations of the Attainable Housing Review. So the first point on this slide just says that there may be a need to include policies that have regard for housing market pressures, because they have increased significantly over the last 5 or so years, as well as changing demographics to increase housing options that are suitable for young adults, I would say young families, and the aging population. The next point on here says that the official plan could set higher density targets for new residential development occurring in greenfield areas where full services are available and require a certain percentage of new builds to be ARU ready. So that would include like having developers have tie-ins for additional residential units in the new builds in new subdivisions. Yeah, I don't know what the committee's opinion on that would be. And then the third point is that the official plan could include a policy that either requires or encourages proponents to demonstrate how matters pertaining to market-based housing needs, including affordability and attainability, are addressed through their proposal. So that would likely involve requiring some sort of report in support of a application for a draft plan approval. Sorry.
Okay, questions on those 3 points there? Anybody have any questions on those? I guess the only concern with that is for me, if developers see an opportunity to build units with ARUs attached, which may become very popular, it's going to put a real strain on capacities of water, maybe not so much water, but more sewage capacity, which I think is going to be a problem going forward, because I think everybody struggles with capacities. And by adding all these ARUs, it could put a lot more strain on the systems. And I'm not sure how people are going to be able to maintain that. Brian, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I think that especially with the pressures of new builds coming in and more developers coming into our community, it's already putting a very big strain on our services, and this is going to add that much more. That's my biggest concern, is just to what you were saying as well, John.
Just with an ARU, is there a development fee on that? Or is that just picked up by existing residents for the expansion of that?
Through you, Chair, the province has recently prohibited development fees on the ARUs. So it's just all part of the other.
Just to the chair's point. So if you've got an influx of them coming in within a new development, then that will eat up the capacity of the existing water and wastewater that I guess you can't foresee when you're approving the subdivision.
Through you, Chair. I think studies have found so far that it hasn't had a significant impact on that water and wastewater capacity when it's, one. But yeah, it has potential for it.
Hasn't yet.
Large units and multiple units.
Yeah, hasn't yet.
Hasn't.
Yeah, thank you.
And just to add to that, with the new building that's put on that property, the overall tax rate would go up for that property, would it not? Because the value is more. So there's a little bit there, but I see where Jim's coming from.
Thank you, Chair. So next up in our slide deck is actually the transportation portion, which the county engineer is here to present on.
Thank you, Abby. And through the chair, it's just a general update on some transportation policies. I'll go through these slides fairly quickly. But again, you see on the first slide, talk about sort of the motherhood statement with regard to safe and efficient movement of people and goods. We're not just talking about cars and trucks when we talk about county roadways. We're also talking about things like broadband infrastructure, water, natural gas, hydroelectric power, anything and everything that needs to travel from point A to point B tends to do so within a county right of way. And many of our policies are based around providing room within the right of way for all these public utilities that serve a public good. Just some general facts for those of you who don't know, if we have over 1,700 lane kilometers of roads and more than 252 actually bridges and big culverts on our county roads. We do everything and anything that does to do with the county road network, including things around emergency response, fire radio communications. Now we actually also provide 911 communications within the county. So we do and also do emergency preparedness activities. So we oversee a fair amount of infrastructure and services in the county. The next page talks about what happened last time we had an official plan review. And I can add more about some of these if you're interested, but certainly not what we're here to talk about today. The next slide is our map. And you can see on our map quite a lot of heavy blue lines. Those would be our sort of our arterial road network. So high volume roads, generally high posted speed limit roads. Quite a bit of green as well, which is our collector road network. Again, these are roads that just have less traffic, so they're serving sort of a different need or design purpose, which is, again, just moving goods and services from point A to point B and people. And then red, there's a few red on here. Those are our anticipated sort of 4-lane roads. And we've just about completed our roundabout. I'll talk about that in a minute at Glendon Drive and Van Eck Road. We're certainly seeing a lot of pressure. You can see all of these red lines, other than a couple right around Strathroy, connect to the city of London, which generates a heck of a lot of traffic onto our road network. So today we're talking about a couple of things here, just chat a little bit about our road widening policies, just give you an update on what's going on with our construction projects, namely the roundabout. That's sort of the big one. And then just some general areas of discussion. So we changed the practice of land dedication for road widening, essentially to provide for an opportunity for the County of Middlesex to acquire lands to be added to the public highway as part of certain planning applications, consents, plans of subdivision, those sorts of things. And again, really, in many cases, we're not talking about adding asphalt or lanes of travel to these roads. We're providing space within the public realm to manage things like storm drainage, so road ditches, things like public utilities. Again, we're seeing lots of challenges now to fit broadband and natural gas and hydro and water and sewer and storm sewer. And then sidewalks and multi-use pathways. More and more of these pressures take up more and more space. And that physical space, the philosophy is those spaces are within the public realm and should be provided within the public highway so they can be maintained as part of our everyday activities, whether it's at the county level or at the municipal level. There is some change in the PPS lately about giving exemptions for site plan control, which is one of the measures we can use to acquire this land for smaller residential developments of 10 or less units. To date, we've had cooperation generally with these types of developers simply because in many cases, we are providing some relief to them for things like ownership of sidewalks, for example. So a condition may be applied where they may want to have a sidewalk or give a pedestrian connection to an existing urban area or settlement area. And in many times when we're asking for this road widening, it allows us to create space in the public highway to provide for that type of infrastructure. So, in many cases, it is to the benefit of these developers to provide that land for these types of utilities so that they don't fall under the ownership of these developers. So our next slide, my computer work for me here. Silly. Okay. Is the Glendon Drive roundabout? Just an update on this. We started this project back in September last year, and we had it functional in about the middle of November before the winter weather really hit us. So many thanks to our contractor and consultant on this project for getting that done with some expediency. We do have more work to complete this coming year. Actually, we'll be getting into some works as early as next week to prepare for the realignment of Coldstream Road, but also to do things like final grading around the boulevards, some of the pedestrian connections, top lift asphalt and landscaping. And then you can see on the next slide, it's just some pictures of the staging. So if you're familiar with the area, the first thing that we did was we shifted all the traffic. We had the traffic run along the existing east-west alignment on Glendon Drive and created the north side of the roundabout. The next page shows you we diverted the traffic. It's kind of hidden underneath the title block, but we've moved the traffic over to the north side of the roundabout and really constructed sort of the heart of the roundabout in phase 2. And then phase 3, it's a nice nighttime drawing here. You can see from top down. That's the final configuration of the roundabout. Of course, there's more paving and work to do there just to clean things up this coming spring and summer. But you see it functions very well. This is a nice shot. You can see a school bus and a tractor trailer along with other vehicles maneuvering safely through the roundabout. Again, just reminding everyone, you always stay to the right, yield to the left, yield to anyone who's already in the roundabout, drive slow and pay attention to signage. There is some confusion about the lay-by lane that you can see on this photograph for travelers who are heading westbound to take a right turn onto Van Eck Road. But I think most people have figured that out now, and it's running quite smoothly. One of the nice benefits of roundabouts is that when we do have collisions, they're usually pretty minor in nature, fender benders, and not resulting in any serious injuries. We had a couple of areas sort of put forward for discussion. Thanks for this, Abby. So one is about our entrance permit process and our entrance policies. So typically we we have the authority to manage all accesses on and entrances onto county roads through our highways bylaw. So our authority isn't given through a planning application. It's just generally exercised at that point, simply because we're typically at the times we're creating new access, or if we're seeing changes of use on properties, it allows us to upgrade our accesses to the suit the use that we're anticipating on site. So the main three factors of that is to preserve infrastructure. So when we're seeing a land use that's going to use more heavy vehicles or increase the volume of traffic, we see if it's a gravel driveway, it might not be appropriate. We might see potholes in that driveway. We may see the edge of the roadway breakaway. So paving driveways are generally determined on volume of traffic. And that certainly helps us preserve county infrastructure. And then we talk about efficiency and safety sort of in the same breath, but this is to make sure that if there's a use that's going to use many sort of large vehicles that may take more time to enter or exit from these properties, we make sure that through traffic on the road can maneuver around those safely and efficiently, and also make sure that we're providing access points so that drivers can see well in every direction. We're not creating choke points or creating issues where we're having backups of traffic, making things challenging for people to enter and exit sites. So all those sort of things we look at from an engineering perspective. One thing we do have in our policy, which I think is important to mention, our entrance permits are issued with a 365-day expiry. So developers have a year to fulfill the conditions of the entrance permit, with the understanding sort of two benefits to that. One is that we're not forcing people to do road work in inclement weather. You wouldn't want to be doing it this time of year, obviously. So it allows for developers to plan ahead, budget, and have work undertaken sort of in our normal construction season. The other reason for that simply is the county recognizes that the cost of these improvements are sometimes significant, and giving developers a year to fulfill those conditions allows them in many cases to, if they're building a subdivision, perhaps to sell some lots or have some occupancy of some buildings. If it's a commercial development, they may be able to be under operation and conducting business prior to having to do that final work on the entrance. So we're trying to be considerate of the fact that some of these requests are expensive, but they are necessary. But we're trying to make it easier on developers to sort of smooth out the expenditures to implement the requirements of these permits. The last points here, we talk about agribusiness and farm gate business. The county is mindful of the fact, the county roads department is mindful of the fact that we don't want to negatively impact the agricultural base of our communities. We do see from time to time and seasonally, farmers will do some farm gate business and might have sort of a fall market of some sort. We've had many occasions where we see corn stands pop up during the harvest season from year to year. And those type of businesses we would consider to be ancillary to the agricultural use on the property. So the county wouldn't have an additional condition on entrances for those types of operations unless we saw something where traffic was intensified to the point where we're having some concerns or there was some unsafe use of those access points. So a good example of this is, we see the corn crib just south of Strathroy on Adelaide Road. And it is one of those properties that come to us every year, and they go through a permit process with us because they have a looped driveway and they do have a significant amount of traffic accessing that site. But there are others that are simply, much, much less intense, and we don't have concerns about those types of, sort of family farm businesses on our county roads. The agribusiness ones are challenging for us from time to time. Again, we tend to get great cooperation with our partners, but we're talking about different types of poultry production. We may have large scale hog production. Those types of agribusiness certainly use much larger types of vehicles, much heavier vehicles that have a bigger impact on the county road. And generally, those operators want to provide an access that is easier to maintain in the long run versus, asphalt versus a gravel driveway. Certainly is easier to maintain. Also much easier for the users to drive in and out of those establishments when they can get up on a hard surface platform to enter and exit the county road network. But again, we do talk a fair bit just from our road policies in general about being mindful of the type of traffic that's on our roads and make sure that we're being mindful of the agricultural nature of Middlesex County with everything we do in the Middlesex County Roads Department. We do talk a fair bit about the single access community policy. Generally, from a transportation engineering standpoint, certainly flow of traffic having more than one access point, especially when we talk about sort of larger scale developments with many units, just generally makes more sense. It eases congestion. It makes flow through tends to make flow through the development more dispersed and easier for travel. And most importantly, it provides redundancy for access for emergency services. So our big challenge right now, we see a lot of condominium developments where you might have 40, 50, 60 units with a single access point to those developments. Our concern is always at some point in time, that access might be blocked. Now, it might be blocked by some malfunction of a vehicle where somebody stalls or gets trapped at that entrance. But really more often than that is when we get into looking at how these sites are serviced. And if the access road, under that access road, if it's packed full of underground services, it would be challenging in the event of a water main break or a collapsed pipe, or even sort of a normally scheduled maintenance of some of this infrastructure or replacement of this infrastructure in the future, that you may unintentionally landlock the residents of those developments. And more importantly, you may prevent emergency response for an ambulance to respond or a fire truck to be able to attend one of these units that may be quite far from the ultimate entrance to this development. So when we look at these types of things, we've got a couple of examples here, I think. So for example, this is a couple of stacked townhouses that could exist anywhere in the county. We wouldn't have a huge transportation concern for something of this scope. Again, we would manage where the green arrow is, we would manage the flow of traffic in and out of this site with an appropriate engineering design of that intersection. So if the scale of this was much bigger, we may ask for turning lanes, left and right turn lanes. For something of this scale, we would have what's called a left turn slip around and a right turn taper, which is mainly for traffic efficiency around the intersection. So if someone is waiting to make a turn, flow by traffic can slow and get around that waiting vehicle on a hard surface. But more importantly here, we certainly probably would not see this development have servicing installed under that entranceway. It likely would just come off the edge of the road and come in over the boulevard area into these buildings. One, it's much easier for a developer or an owner to maintain in the future. And two, it's actually probably much easier to install at the time of construction. So for something like this, if there are no utilities installed in that driveway, we certainly wouldn't have an engineering concern about, an emergency services concern about response. We get into the next page, we get into a couple of concerns. So this is the green arrow is the access up to the county road. And again, we would manage this likely in this case with some sort of turning lanes. But Street B is a future connection to, or maybe a future connection, a good example of one, to development that isn't approved, may not be even in the concept stage when something of this design is considered. And then we would have concern about our other challenge with developments like this is there may be a desire for a future connection to another county road. So this is more about talking about how we disperse traffic and move traffic more efficiently through county road networks. And often we see sort of these temporary traffic turnarounds or temporary turning circles at the end of these streets for an indeterminate period of time. And there's been challenges where in the long term, residents assume these are cul-de-sacs, assume they're going to remain cul-de-sacs forever. And we lose the ability to make a future connection to an adjacent development. So there are some local concerns when we have these types of configurations in the long term that can become challenging for us to manage that full traffic flow at some point in the future. So we are, the argument might be that, well, why do we have to take a special provision around that connection at Street A? It's because we may never see Street B connect anywhere but to two cul-de-sacs at the terminus of both of those ends of that development. So a little extra careful in those types of situations. So next page is just I'm here. I'm happy to answer any questions as always. So, Mr. Chair, I'll just turn it back to you. And again, happy to answer any questions about transportation policy with relation to planning.
Like, Chris, if we have, we see occasionally gated communities and they only want one entrance in and out. Is there some, like, if that gets blocked, then as you said earlier, that creates huge problems. Is there some way that, I don't know, how do we deal with something like that on a gated community where the developer, that's what he wants is one entrance, but for emergency services, we need to have that second exit?
Yeah, and thank you through the chair. Again, it's the question becomes, or the challenge becomes, having a discussion with a developer to say, you're many of these gated communities, to be fair or not, technically tend to get targeted towards seniors. And those types of communities tend to see more ambulance calls. And seniors tend to understand, at least in my experience, that it's important that the ambulance has a way to get to your home, to get access to help you or your family in times of emergency. So developers generally have come to the understanding that the additional costs of keeping utilities out of the main access road to these developments is certainly balanced by the fact they want to provide a safe community for their future residents. The other thing that helps in this situation is in like a condominium type development, there's not a public road. So all of the land is available for utilities to be installed sort of independently of the road itself. So they have more boulevard space. They may have more area that's not in that sort of traveled portion of the entrance road because they're not constrained by a public highway or a public road in that sense. They own all of the land. In that sense, they can have infrastructure sort of wherever they want it to be from a sort of a land perspective. So they do have some flexibility to be able to move these things around a little bit more than we might in sort of a rural, like a small subdivision where the roads are eventually going to be turned over and the utilities being turned over to the local municipality. So there is some flexibility that they gain that a traditional sort of subdivision may not.
Brian, do you have anything you want to add? No? Okay. Well,
No,
it's,
sorry, John. Couldn't get it off mute. Chris, I had a question for you on, you talked about a 1 year giving developers to do their entrances and stuff. Is that the same timeline you would allow, like for business to do in a passing lane, a slip lane, that type of thing?
Yeah, through the chair to the warden. Yeah, that's exactly what any entrance permit that we issue at the county is a 1 year term by which to complete the conditions of that permit. And I would say that there are times when we've been approached to have an extension to those deadlines, and we've been very generous with permitting extension of those deadlines as well. So whether it's a commercial entrance permit, just a residential driveway, a street intersection, all are treated the same way with regards to timelines for doing that type of work. It just makes sense from our perspective, and I think it's helpful for the developers to have that flexibility as well.
Okay, thank you.
Why did it take so long for the Glendon Drive roundabout to be put in? Like, that's already a very populous area now. It seems to me it would have made more sense to have that put in years ago, knowing that we were going to develop around there. I live around there. I pass through there every day. There's more traffic in there than there is Toronto, or I feel like.
It's a great question through the chair. This is something we've been envisioning for quite a while. I mean, the Glennon Drive roundabout was considered back in 2015 when we did, so 10 years ago now, when we did our Glennon Drive streetscape 4-laning environmental assessment. So back in 2015, the rules have changed, but we had a more vigorous test with regards to being able to implement these types of robust traffic flow improvements. The other challenge for us is at the time, it's a little easier now, but at the time we didn't have a policy within the official plan that allowed us to do a taking or a land acquisition for areas that we were considering for roundabouts. So as that commercial sort of corridor started to develop, we were able to get land in order for us to fit the roundabout into that intersection. Roundabouts take up a ton of space. You live out there, you see how big it is. So it does take time, years and years in many cases, for us to acquire those lands in advance of having the roundabout be able to fit on the public highway. Again, without a massive cost to the county or to the local municipality in order for us to go in and have to actually acquire those lands through other means. The balance of that too is that, we are still at a point, again, this is a roundabout that's designed to be a 2-lane roundabout at some point in the future. It's just one right now, but we designed it for 2, anticipating future traffic growth. And we still have lots of plans through that corridor to 4-lane the remainder of Glendon Drive, right from the city of London all the way up to the 402. So, we have, again, another 5-10 years worth of work to do on that corridor. The traffic signal that was there, it functioned and from a county perspective, a service level that was acceptable to us leading up to the roundabout. So we're trying to do things at the right time. It's a big investment. I think we've said in there, it's a $6 million investment. So it's, again, not insignificant in cost. So it's doing the right thing at the right time. There's lots of spots where we're monitoring. It's our official plan. We showed the transportation schedule earlier. There's lots of red lines on that map that we're anticipating to be 4 lanes. Those have been red lines since I started at the county 25 years ago. And they were red lines for time before that as well. So we're really looking in, a 40 to 50 year type of window where we're expecting to see volumes hit those levels where we're going to have challenges having those roads operate efficiently as a 2-lane roadway. So at some point in time, we'll see Hamilton Road and Highbury and Egremont and those types of roads go to 4 lanes. And we have policies in place that allow us to enhance our right of way when we start looking at those 4 lanes to be able to consider things like roundabouts at some of those critical intersections. So it is a long-term plan, and that did take a long time for us to think about that roundabout. So, but the actual environmental planning for that started 10 years ago. So we've been thinking about it for a while.
I think at this point in time, we're going to stop the proceedings today, and we'll have Dirk and Abby set up another meeting so we can carry on. It's now 10 after 3, so we're running a little bit past our agenda time, but as I say, if there's any further questions for Chris or Abby or Dirk, feel free, I'm sure, to email them with them, and or comments. If you have any further comments, feel free to get a hold of them and let them know what you're thinking. And we will have another meeting as soon as we can find an appropriate time for everybody to be here. So at this time, I would ask, we're not going to do any new business or anything. We're just going to adjourn the meeting today and plan for another meeting. So I would ask for a mover to adjourn.